What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I am back from my vacation. Yes, I absolutely loved that cruise. FYI, I will be at San Diego Comic-Con, so I don't know how many of you guys are going to be there. Maybe I'll do a fan meetup. I'll probably announce it here in the next week or so. We'll try to find a better place to do it than we did last time. Because I didn't realize, I had never been to San Diego before. I didn't realize how much of a madhouse it was, although I guess I probably should have known. But we are back on our regular schedule, which means we are covering Infinite Frontier. Now, as you guys know, Infinite Frontier is this next great big huge multiversal event. So, in the playlist for Infinite Frontier, we did put in there the story of Kingdom Come, because that was kind of a necessity. Now, there is, and this is something that we'll cover later on, we'll actually do Thy Kingdom Come, and also the Kingdom as well, which is the Kingdom Come / JSA crossover, which is actually what the Earth 22 universe here in Dark Crisis is more based off of. But to understand that, you have to understand Kingdom Come. So that's the reason why we covered it. But what we know right now, kind of continuing things up from where we were before, that you've got Alan Scott, and then you have his son Obsidian, and they're basically looking for Alan's daughter, Obsidian's sister, the superhero known as Jade. And the reason why is because the JSA headquarters in Gotham had basically exploded. There was an indication that Jade's power had been there, and so the question became, what happened to her? And they're quite literally on the trail trying to figure out who it was that had done this and that had presumably taken out Jade. And so, of course, their trail ultimately ends up leading them to a guy by the name of Shade. Now, people who are longtime readers of DC Comics, what I mean longtime, I mean since 0 Hour Crisis in Time, they are aware of the character of Roger Swift. The reality here is he's been around for much longer than that. But like so many characters from DC Comics, he's received, reboots, new origins, all that kind of stuff with each passing crisis. Way back in the day, in the 1940s, in the old All-Star comics, he was originally part of the Injustice Society. And the way the Injustice Society originally existed back then is they were essentially the opposite or the antithesis of the Justice Society itself. That where the various superheroes came together to form the JSA as it existed, the Injustice Society of America was basically their villains forming a team. It just made logical sense given the way the comics were written at the time, and it was really popular. I will say that I think the popularity of Shade really reached its peak almost immediately after 0 Hour, and then just kind of started tapering off after that, to the point that now he's one of these characters you see every once in a while, and unless you're like a really hardcore fan, you're probably not going to know or care who this guy is. But the ones that do love this guy love to see him appear. I don't have no idea how many people are fans of Shade. But the reality is this guy is, by all standards of measurement, he has the ability to manipulate what's in effect Dark Force energy, shadow energy. Those of you guys coming from Marvel Comics, you know the Dark Force is being able to manipulate like literal shadows, the living abyss of Null, different things like that, right? Just the nature of shadows themselves. That's effectively what Shade does. Again, he's been around long before that, so it's not really one of these instances where DC copied Marvel or those of you guys who are looking to create those arguments that don't matter. But the thing about this is that this guy has been around the block more than a few times, and that's why their trail leads them to him, because this guy has kind of been around the various villains that exist out there. So even if he's not the one responsible for the vanishing of Shade, at the very least, he may have information leading to that. Now, one of the things to remember is that the role of Alan Scott and Obsidian in them is only one part of this story. That what we end up doing is basically switching back to Roy Harper. Now, one of the big focal points here is that Roy Harper is simply just back, and we don't really know how he came back. We simply just know that he's here, and he's in possession of a Black Lantern. And that's one of the things that blew me away, and a lot of people who are familiar with DC Comics surprised them as well. Because whenever a person is brought back to life by a Black Lantern ring, they're usually under the direct control of a Black Lantern ring, right? Like it literally dominates their will, and they basically come back as zombies. With Roy Harper, it wasn't that way. Roy Harper came back as we'd always seen him, and not only that, he was in control of the Black Lantern ring, which is not how that's supposed to work. So it's one of those things where whatever's going on with him and this ring is pretty far removed from the standard quo of Black Lanterns. So that's really kind of the question, and one of the reasons why you saw a lot of people in the comments who were like, okay, what's going on with Roy Harper? Now, of course, he's also looking for his daughter, kind of hunting around, but the thing about this is that whenever he utilizes the ring, he falls under its control. So it's not as though this ring is not a Black Lantern ring. It is. It's just the relationship between Roy and the ring is different from what we're normally used to seeing. And so that's why when he suddenly ends up, when he used the ring at the end of the last story and then suddenly just flew into space, that once he regains his bearings, and in a lot of ways trying to find his daughter is what kind of anchors him back to reality, that he's able to sort of retake control over the ring, but not necessarily use it in the sense of like conjuring constructs and different things like that. And that's the sort of quagmire that he's in, is on one hand, he wants to use the ring, but on the other hand, he doesn't want to turn into like some kind of a Black Lantern zombie. But in the midst of all this, he's suddenly met by the arrival of someone. Now again, at that point, we switch over to Earth 22, what is essentially the Kingdom Come universe, just kind of a little modified. And again, that'll make more sense once we cover the Kingdom and Thy Kingdom Come, the Kingdom Come and JSA crossover. Once we cover that, this will also make a lot more sense as well. But Magog, of course, is a reformed guy, and that's why you have Calvin Ellis, right? The Superman of the Justice Incarnate. You've also got Thomas Wayne, Flashpoint Batman, who were here, and they're a little surprised by this guy. Now again, when you see Magog talking and basically having this understanding of the multiverse, that all came from Thy Kingdom Come. That was the significance of that story, because you literally had Kingdom Come Superman, who basically transitioned to the Justice Society of America, which is a pretty cool story. It was a pretty cool set of events, but that's why he has this recognition, because if you guys recall our coverage of the Kingdom Come story, he didn't know anything about the multiverse, and there's nothing to indicate any of the heroes know anything about the multiverse. The story was originally self-contained. It wasn't designed to tie into anything. It was really an Elseworlds story without the Elseworlds title, and it was just in some alternate reality out there somewhere, things popped off and a superhero civil war happened, the end, and like that was it. That was literally the whole thing here. So that's why when you see Magog here, he's not a tried and true villain. He doesn't attack them because he's like, good guys, I gotta kill you. It's not really anything like that. It's more of every time the multiverse shows up here, there's problems, right? There's issues that unfold. Now, there is a little more that goes on with this character, and of course, we'll learn about that once we get to the end of this. But the thing about it is, of course, the Justice Incarnate shows up here, right? So you got like Machine Head, you got Captain Carrot. I love Captain Carrot. Captain Carrot's super bunny. You got him, you got Mary Marvel, you got Aquawoman, you got all those characters that show up here, but that's where things are kind of halted by Calvin, because from their perspective, it's a fight breaking out here between a villain and a hero, or a villain that was supposed to have been redeemed and basically ended up going back to being a bad guy, when the response of Calvin is, no. He says the reason why we're here is because the ship that Thomas Wayne had escaped from, pieces of it are all over the place, and we're trying to figure out what's going on with this ship, who made it, all that stuff, because we have no clue what's happening here, right? It's this great big huge multiversal puzzle, and they only have one piece of it, and they don't fully understand everything that's taking place. But remember, when it comes to the multiverse in DC Comics, it's all about harmonic frequencies, right? Remember, every universe vibrates with a particular frequency. So for the sake of discussion here, right, using arbitrary frequencies here, we could say that the main DC universe, Earth 0, vibrates in the key of A, and Earth 1 vibrates in the key of A sharp, and Earth 2 is in B, and Earth 3 is in B sharp, and so on and so forth. The reason why this matters is because if you are a group like the Justice Incarnate, or you're familiar with the multiverse, somebody like the Flash, you could have a superhero who could just show up. Batman could show up here and just say, hey, what's going on, Barry? But Barry could detect his harmonic frequency and realize you're vibrating in the key of B. You are not from this universe. You are from a different universe. And so he would know he's not native to that place. And then start asking questions like, why are you here? How'd you get here? So on and so forth. But it's why Calvin Ellis can touch this ship and realize it comes from a different reality. So that's why they end up traveling back to Earth 23, to his reality, to kind of continue the hunt on where this ship came from. And so at that point, you switch over to Barry Allen. And he's kind of been the character that's been missing here for a little while, right? That the efforts of Barry and his journey to kind of explore the multiverse or see what's going on with the multiverse, different things like that, ultimately led him to a particular location, right? Known as Earth Omega. We don't know the significance of it outside of the fact that it seems to be the end of the multiverse, but the only thing we knew is that he's basically here, or at least seemingly being manipulated by the Psycho Pirate. Now, one of the cool things, and one of the things that I love the most about this, is that Joshua Williamson and DC are going to give us the full-on explanation of Psycho Pirate in terms of how he exists now. A little bit of a spoiler, although we will cover it later on, is that Psycho Pirate is the only, or really one of the only characters that exists now in the DC landscape who is aware of his history before the events of the first Crisis on Infinite Earths. And that's how he always was. That was always the nature of Psycho Pirate. And it's why he always maintained just kind of this sort of interesting element about him, and why a lot of fans also saw him as just kind of a bit of a wonky character that was intriguing and a little eccentric, because he was one of the only holdovers who remembered the way things were, that he existed before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And when that Crisis event ended and you had New Earth, and most of the heroes didn't remember anything before that, he did. And so it was always just a part of his character. He's like, I always remember the way that things were supposed to be. A lot of it seems to be the result of him using Medusa's mask, the ability to manipulate the emotional state of other individuals to achieve a particular goal. But that's what's going on here with Barry. That Barry's basically being tricked by illusions using Medusa's mask into thinking he's running alongside Jay Garrick and he has to protect the multiverse, and to do that he has to keep running faster, when the reality here is he's basically hooked up to a machine that's not that far removed from the one that was used during the original Crisis event to power the efforts of the Anti-Monitor, and in turn is just running faster and faster and faster. But all of this is being done by the manipulations of Psycho Pirate. other. And so that's what's so crazy here is he does not actually know what he's doing. He has no clue what's happening. Now, in terms of how this will affect things on a larger scale, we'll of course find out about that as time goes on. But what you end up doing here is basically transitioning over to Alan Scott, or back to Alan Scott and to Obsidian, where they basically end up locating what was in effect a place called Command D. Now, of course, this is located in Bloodhaven, but the idea here is that after the events of essentially the Dark Crisis story, right? So Batman Who Laughs and all that kind of stuff, Perpetua and everything, after all that had been done, the world had become aware of the multiverse, the threats in the multiverse, that much like we talked about before, that the DEO's entire basis shifted away from being a group that was in effect Amanda Waller of the Suicide Squad's kind of intelligence arm, keeping her abreast of all the different superpowered beings that exist out there, monitoring them, seeing which ones could presumably be used for the Suicide Squad, as well as which ones are credible threats. And now they focus on the multiverse, the various threats that exist out there from across all of creation. So for those of you guys who are coming from Marvel Comics, think of the current function of the DEO as basically armor, right? The alternate reality monitoring and operations, response division or whatever it is. But basically that, right? The group from Marvel Comics that monitors the multiverse. That's what the DEO does now. Now, of course, their charter is a little more direct than Armor's is. And in fact, we'll actually see how that plays out. But the thing about this is that as they get in there, they kind of sense these little indications of power that belong to Jade, right? Kind of picking up on what are essentially breadcrumbs, little bits of her. Now, of course, during this time, they end up coming across Bones, right? The guy who's running the DEO. And the question being, what does this guy have to do with it, right? Are they responsible for the kidnapping of Jade? And so once they basically follow this guy through, they ultimately get to this giant ship that he has. They're basically met by Extract. Now, of course, Extract is a character that is a little bit ambiguous here in terms of how she's being told in the story. We don't necessarily know her full backstory. We simply just know that she's the agent that's sent in by Bones to basically retrieve people or to save people or whatever it is, but the ability to teleport in and teleport out, hence the name Extract. And so as a result of that, she basically jumps in and then essentially sets a really, shows Alan Scott and Obsidian they had in effect walked into a trap. Now they do what they can to hold off against these guys, but of course Chase ends up stepping in and she basically incapacitates the both of them, and they're really kind of out for the count, right? They're basically taken. Now, this is when things get really, really wild, and this is where this entire story, the entire nature of Infinite Frontier, Dark Crisis, this is all a reboot. So for those of you guys who have been looking at the nature of or at least looking at the reviews where people are saying this entire Crisis event is really no different than 0 Hour or any of that stuff, they're really accurate here, right? And it's one of those things where people are in a lot of ways kind of getting a little tired of it, where you got the whole Perpetua thing, the restoration of the multiverse. That's just one part of the story. Now this is the other part of the story, kind of picking up after that. And in a lot of ways, it really is the kind of grand reshuffling of DC. What's so ironic though, is that for those of you guys who have been reading comics for any real measure of time, you'll probably agree with me in saying that what DC's doing here is really no different than what Marvel did in the early 2000s, right? With like Spider-Man One More Day, House of M, Civil War, Thor Ragnarok, all that stuff, right? Running all the way up to the heroic age, right? So like Messiah Complex, Messiah War, all those things. It's really no different here, right? It really is in a lot of ways the exact same thing that Marvel was doing. That if the events of Perpetua and that whole Crisis event was basically them just quote unquote rebooting the multiverse, what this is doing is showing us what that reboot looks like now, right? So think of it like as a kind of extended epilogue or a part 2 of DC reboots yet again, right? That's really kind of what this is. But what this does is it switches over to Roy Harper, where he's basically on this ship, right? And what's crazy is he's met by a guy named Agent Hammond. That's when Hammond's like, we're with the DEO, right? And the response of Roy is, okay, so like you keep an eye out for aliens, right? And he's like, well, aliens were our task before everything popped off. But after everything that's happened with like the multiverse and all that kind of stuff, we were reinstated with a whole new mission. So literally to protect Earth-Zero's interests from a different kind of invader. And so where Roy asks, so basically you keep your eye out for anyone trying to like crash into our world or conquer our world or invade our world, the response of Hammond is exactly, right? That's exactly what we do. Or somebody who just essentially came back from the dead. And that's when they incapacitate Roy Harper. And that's when Hammond says, like, we weren't really sure if this was gonna work because you were a Black Lantern, but at the end of the day, I do have some familiarity with lantern rings. And that's when we find out this guy Hammond is actually Hector Hammond. Now, the initial response that I had here was, okay, so how did this happen? Because the last time we saw Hector Hammond, he was a little guy with a giant head. How did this change? And this is one of those reboot elements where what we end up finding out is that when the multiverse was returned to normal, Hector Hammond was reset back to 0. He literally says that, right? Like when reality returned, I was quote unquote reset to factory settings, so to speak. So he's back to the way he was before everything went nuts with his experiment. So he's still every bit the villain that he always was before. But what he says, or what he does, is he transitions Roy to a place called the Bleed. Now, for those of you guys who don't know know about that, and I think we talked about it a little bit in some of the videos that we did before, the bleed is basically the place between universes. Jonathan Hickman borrowed heavily off of this when he was doing the whole Avengers and New Avengers story, and you had the space between universes. So it's really the exact same concept, just borrowed from DC Comics. Now this is when things get really, really intriguing, because what Hector says is this is called the bleed, right? The space between worlds in the multiverse. And he says, when we heard that you were alive, we had to know how. And so we sent Extract to collect you. She thought you were just a simple archer. Imagine our surprise when you had that ring. And he says, that black ring you have on your hand, I'm not even sure it's from our multiverse, but it chose you. Why? And when Roy responds, I don't know, the response of Hector is, we didn't expect you to, or I didn't expect you to, but a deal has been made for you and that ring, Roy Thomas, and then ultimately we never find out what it is because a massive crash happens. Now, the big takeaway from this is the statement from Hector Hammond that we're not even sure if that ring is from our multiverse. That's one of the things to understand here about this story. It's a massive expansion to the DC landscape that is really being altered, right? That's really changing everything we've known up to this point. And I don't mean to do the whole Marvel Comics, the obligatory, and it's going to change everything forever. I don't mean to come off like that, but it's simply one of these things where it is a pretty big change that happens in this story, the entire events of Dark Crisis. And so what ends up happening is in this momentary distraction based on whatever it was that had happened to the ship of Hector Hammond, that you basically have Roy who ends up conjuring constructs, turns into a bit of a kind of zombified version of himself, but it does allow him to basically overcome Hector by literally creating a construct of Hal Jordan to attack Hector Hammond, which is a nice little touch. But somebody somewhere just kind of says, okay, so like they must have found some zombie world in the multiverse, and you know what that means? Aim for the head. And we end up finding out this statement's being made by Jade, Power Girl, along with Atom Smasher and like Danger, and like it's cool. And it looks like Wildcat, but Wildcat, as far as I'm aware, is a guy, so it's kind of weird to see like a chick Wildcat. Maybe I'm missing something. I'm not entirely sure. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.